with others, and he wrote it, but he didn't want to write how it works. Because he knew when he brought that, when he attempted to put down specifically what we were doing, because it was being done by word of mouth in different parts around the country, and as we said, yeah, I tell you, and then you tell them. Well, it doesn't even sound like what I told you, because you just went over there. And then when he went to lay it out in front of them, it was going to start a war, because the guys from Cleveland were going to look, that isn't how we're doing it out here. And the guys in New York and Akron, and you know what I'm saying? And so he just finally went, okay, here it is. So we now have taken this message and codified it. We put it there, and he put it out for comment, as the word goes. And he got a lot of comments. Got a lot of comments. And it was out of that turmoil that the term God as we understand him came in. Up till then, the God that they were speaking about in the Oxford movement was Jesus. There was nobody was pulling any punches, and Clarence maintained that to the day he died. Drove everybody crazy. We all know who the higher power is, Jesus. And of course, this half of the room got up and left. The other half of the room, there, see, I told you so. So it was very divisive. And here it came. Because of this fight, God as you understand him. Now nobody can fight. How can you fight against whatever you say goes? And it became a wonderful, important part of Alcoholics Anonymous. It is why the door to AA is wide open to anyone, including an atheist, an agnostic, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, Jewish people. I mean, the whole world is encompassed in that statement. And that was a wonderful blessing that our message got transformed to that degree in its formation. So out of this, and then this afternoon I'm going to talk more about what I think this is, but out of this came a message of spirituality as opposed to religion. And so the difference being, in my judgment, that a religion will tell you what the higher power is, and after explaining the attributes of this power, of this God, whatever you want to call it, then says to you, aren't you attracted to this? Isn't this something you'd be interested in? Here is this power, performed these miracles. It's been around for 5,000 years, 2,000 years. Don't you see that this would be something wonderful to believe in? And then if you like it, then you say, yes, I like that, and I'm going to join in on that. But what about a spiritual organization? We clearly have a different message, because we don't start with that. We don't start with, hey, here's how we're going to have you join. We're going to tell you all about this higher power. We don't have that. So how do we ever get anybody to join? What do we tell them? What is the big deal? Well, you see, we don't serve the general public. We'd have a hard time selling AA to the general public. You know, hey, you just walking by the street with no particular problems. Wouldn't you like to come in here and work 12 hard steps? And then go out and help alcoholics all over the place. Wouldn't you like to do that? No, I'm going to see the Los Angeles Dodgers play this afternoon, and I don't think I'd be interested. So we wouldn't be able to get anybody. So why do we get people? Well, we start with people who are in trouble. That's what we have. We have people who have been driven to us by a very bad disease, who are desperate, And it is just as William James said, the awakening is coupled with the sense of disaster. And so the way I see that we reach people is by pointing at their situation and not the solution. And Dr. Silkworth was one of the people that told Bill to do this. Bill was running around trying to sober up people by telling them about his hot bladder. Hey guys, you don't have to stay here in the bar drinking. I just had this wonderful experience where I was on a mountaintop and I saw white lights and the wind was blowing and God said, "Hi, Bill." And they would say things like, "That happens to me when I drink rum, and I don't see any reason to do that." So on and on and on. He said, what you ought to focus on is the hopelessness of the disease. The hopelessness of the disease. And it basically works like this, that you come in, and my sponsor did it beautifully. I came in out of desperation, in the nut ward, straitjacket, the whole 9 yards, but once I got feeling a little better, I reclassified all that trouble in my head as a minor inconvenience. And so I was in AA in order to save my job. And he would take me around, and I'm listening to people, and then finally he said, "Look, Sandy, you and I have known each other for a few months now. Why don't you level with me what it feels like to be inside of you? Have you ever done that?" And I went, "No." "Go ahead." And I did. I almost started crying. I said, "It's awful being inside of me. It's terrible in here. This is what has happened. I have to drink. I'm afraid of this." And I had seizures and convulsions and straitjackets and people making fun of me, and they're losing my career, and my kids hate me, my wife hates me, my family hates me. It's just awful. And he said, "Well, if you keep drinking, it's really going to get bad." He explained the disease. And if I was a little bit desperate, I suddenly became totally desperate. And that's when people will listen to a spiritual message. And so, historically, we were just saved by having the reverse of outreach. The first thing we do, and that's why step one, is to pull the rug out from the person we're working with so they have nothing to stand on. Nothing. And then they're ready. Then they're ready to hear what we have to say. And that all happened historically. It all was just circumstances, whether it's William James or Dr. Young, Jim Newton taking it to Akron, the Oxford group itself, the failure of the Washingtonians. It seems as if all of these components were whirling around and crystallized in some magic fashion in 1939 and were laid out so that it says, this is precisely how we have recovered. I love those words. It just said, this is it. This is precisely how it is done. And so that's my best shot at sharing how I think the message arrived and is laid out clearly in our literature. And I'm a literature person. I really believe that once you get a message, and it has been laid out, that all we have to do is keep passing the same message from one drunk to another, and we will get the same results. What is the result? This is the last point I want to make. The point of all of this is a spiritual awakening. That is the point of the whole thing. And what we're passing on is how to have a spiritual awakening. Not just how to stay sober. You can stay sober in jail because you can't drink. It's how to have this transforming experience so that there's nothing for alcohol to fix. It's been fixed by the transforming experience, so it's real easy to not drink that day. When that condition is maintained, there's nothing, you just aren't thinking, boy, I wish I had a drink so I could take care of this. You don't need a drink. Anyway, that's enough out of me. Tom, do you have any more you want to add in before we take a break? Okay. Well, then we're set for... Yeah. You think that was all right? Oh, okay. Very, very good. Then we'll eat.
I would like to certainly say thank you to our two speakers. If you have found this part of our format in our presentation today in the workshop intriguing, I would certainly like to encourage you to join us for the second half. They have indicated to me in our talks before today's events that the talk we've just received is only the, if you will, plowing the field for the hopefully the seeds they will plant for us later. So I'd like to all encourage you to come back. Thank our speakers.
I think he's overselling it.
Right, yeah, they just said I may be overselling it, so hopefully I haven't. But by my watch, it's about 10 minutes till noon. What I'd like to ask is that if we could all be back in here at 1:45, so that's about 55 minutes. It'll give you a chance to take a break, grab some lunch. We will start promptly at 1:45, so if you could please be in your seats then, we'd appreciate it. Thank you. Good afternoon. If we could ask everyone to take their seats and get settled in, please.
You know who started that?
Good afternoon. First off, I'd like to thank everyone who was here actually promptly at 1:45. Unfortunately, we had a wonderful lunch. The service was not as expeditious as we had hoped, so I apologize. I said on the way up here that I walked up to the podium when we were breaking with the full intention of saying we are going to be back at 1 o'clock. And then, like all good alcoholics, my mouth opened and something totally different came out. And I'm not quite sure what happened in between the moment of getting up and standing up here, but I think some might relate. So with that, I will not delay any longer. Just again as a reminder, especially for anyone who may just be joining us and didn't have the benefit of attending the morning session, we are going to hear the second half of our talk on the steps, spirituality, and service from Tom I. and Sandy B. They are going to speak for, I suspect, maybe an hour, a little longer. We will then take a very short break, maybe just 5 minutes to allow people to get up and stretch and get another cup of coffee or a glass of water. And we will wrap up today's event by having a Q&A session. And I'll remind everyone of this again, but just so you know, when we do get to the Q&A session, there's a microphone here in the middle of the aisle. What we'll do is we'll just ask everyone to line up if you would like to ask any questions of Tom or Sandy. I know that they're happy to, try to do their best to field any and all questions. So if you have some, please feel free to take advantage of the time we have here today. I'm sure they'll be glad to stay as long as there's someone who would like to ask a question of us. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce again Tom I.
Well, thanks, folks. Glad we made it back. Same old guy, Tom Ivester, an alcoholic. And we're shifting gears on you. I guess, hope you can tell where we're headed with this. That what we did, the old days of the emergence of Alcoholics Anonymous and sort of how things shaped into being. And then Sandy brought us into an excellent presentation about how the message forms and how we start having real substance in what we're doing. And now it's grunt and groaning time now. We got to go to work. And what I want to do is pick up on essentially where we left off in history and shift a little bit into sort of the changing character of how we do our work and how we generate some of our service stuff. Just share a couple of little things with you about those changing times in the history part of it, and then we'll get into it. So, I was a guy that, some of you may know, I originally started AA in a correctional facility, and was blessed to be in a facility with an excellent group. And so when I hit the street, I was well prepared to engage in the program, and that's a good thing, because when the transition is fairly easy, if you're prepared to make the transition and you got someplace to go. And I was well prepared, but when I got to what was to be my hometown and visited what was to be my home group, I swear to God, that was the worst AA meeting I've ever been to in my life. And I told some of the guys, I said, man, if we had a meeting like this in the joint, somebody would have got hurt. We used to do stuff like that, and it was really kind of a sad deal. And it's funny how you come to crossroads, and you gotta make a turn. Sometimes make the good one, sometimes make the bad one. And when I hit that, I was used to well-ordered, really productive groups and a high level of action. And all at once, I'm in a wasteland where there was a little sign of life. And my first thought would be like the next is only about 25 miles to our biggest city, Charlotte. And I knew there was a little action over there. And my first thought was, geez, I'm not going to put up with this junk. And I'm going to go to Charlotte and get in on the quick and slick stuff. But a troubling thought occurred to me. I was the second oldest guy in that town in AA. And the only other one was an old guy, a wonderful fellow, but he was just sort of over the hill. And so disturbing thought was, when do you become responsible? When do you take some responsibility? When do you take a stand? And that was kind of a troubling thought, because it's hard to take on that kind of thinking and then fly in the face of it. So I decided to stay, and probably one of the wisest decisions I ever made. But it was just by default. It wasn't just eagerness to tackle that. It was just default. I wasn't willing to face the guilt of walking off. The guys at Joy heard about it, they'd have hurt me, I guess. So it was a good deal, and I had the great experience of sort of what I was alluding to with some of those early folk in the program, and really got introduced to service in a real rough and ready, raw kind of a style. And that ain't all bad, because it's a good learning stuff. If you like learning to swim, the best way to do it is get in water over your head. And you'll amazing how quickly you can learn to swim, or else you won't be talking about it. And so that's what I was. I was in water over my head, and so I had a lot of spirit, a lot of enthusiasm. I was about like a young goat turned loose, and I'm just running in all directions, doing anything that even looked like it was to be helpful. And I didn't have any real game plan for service or anything like that. But I understood what a good group was, and I understood what some of the ingredients were of making a group, so we set about starting to do that. And when you're the only guy standing in a town, it's an interesting deal. I got introduced to 12-step work in no uncertain terms, and I could regale you with tons of stories. There's nothing more enjoyable in hindsight than a 12-step call. They're not tremendously enjoyable if somebody's throwing up on you at 3 o'clock in the morning. The thrill is gone from that in a hurry. And so I was getting really up to my ears in that kind of stuff, and doing a lot of that kind of work, a lot of organizational stuff. And I tell you about the kind of thing that sort of shaped the ethic a little bit. Along in that period, two things I want to just sort of approach at the same time. One was the emergence of resources beyond the obvious, of just a drunk taking somebody and sobering them up on their own. I didn't realize how dangerous that was until I got sober and smartened up a little bit. But my God, it is just a major miracle that I didn't hurt somebody permanently. I'd get tired of messing with them. I had a guy that was drink of choice. I never was familiar with that term. My drink of choice was whatever you had. It didn't matter to me. But this guy was a more refined fellow. He had a drink of choice. It was bay rum shaving lotion. And I'm telling you, I 12-stepped that guy till God knows, felt like he was a Siamese twin. And finally, I just had enough one day, so I decided to give him aversion therapy. I didn't know the term at that time, but I figured I was going to OD that sucker on shaving lotion. So when I 12-stepped him, I bought a case of bay rum shaving lotion and took him to my house. That's where the detox was at that time. And put him in a rocking chair in my front yard. And I said, buddy, I got news for you. We're going to drink some bay rum. He said, yeah. And so I started feeding that sucker bay rum till he got totally goggle-eyed. And he started saying, I don't want any more. I said, oh, yeah, you do. Yeah, you want some more. And I fed that dude bay rum till he thought he was on the moon. And it worked. He got sober for a record for him for 9 months. I didn't realize, what a crude way that was to deal. But that's back then. Most people didn't go quite that drastic with it. But back then, those days that some people kind of pine for the good old days. People that pine for the good old days either weren't there or have very poor memories. One or the other. Those things of taking folk home like that and sobering them up with whatever you can get, orange juice, Karo syrup, God knows. I've given them everything potable. And just going through that stuff. I never want to go through that again. And so in the middle of all that kind of flurry of stuff, we started to get, other than Akron with Dr. Bob and that, the notion of getting a drunk in a hospital was wishful thinking at best. Didn't exist. If you had enough money to buy the hospital, you might get in under a gastrointestinal disturbance diagnosis. But for taking a drunk there under any conditions was truly wishful thinking. And so I was delighted when we started to see the first cracking of the door. Things happened, and I'll just rush it real quick with this. But it didn't happen because I came in, but about the time that I came in, it was the time the American Medical Association, they never did declare alcoholism an illness, but they kind of acknowledged it as like an illness. And it was enough to crack the door that later led to third-party payments, where it started to get some legal medical standing. And so it cracked the door and started to open up. And I remember when we first started to be able to get a drunk in the hospital as an alcoholic. We literally had to provide sitter service because they didn't want nurses to be bothered with that behavior. And so we literally had to do shifts and go in and work an 8-hour shift or whatever, taking care of drunks. It was interesting sometimes. And I went in one day and I reported for duty, and had an officer, my guy was on the door that was watching the guy, and he said, he's okay, seems to be all right, and won't have any trouble with him. So I go in the room, no drunk. And I said, where is this fool? So I'm looking in the bed, under the bed, behind the curtains, bathroom. The window was only about that wide, so he couldn't have got out of there. And I'm just totally bewildered. And then I heard a little clatter, the old stand-up wall locker. I heard a little clatter. And so I went over and opened the door. Well, the fellow was just mildly confused. He thought he was standing at a urinal. And when I opened that door, he looked at me with just real indignation, and he said, I beg your pardon. I said, pardon my ass. Get out of there. Sometimes it was fun, but I was ever grateful to be able to start opening the door. And I truly mean that. I've had the dubious, kind of an experience I don't ever want to do again. I had a drunk die in my arms one night. Excuse me. And I had nowhere to take him, And so I remember those days with no fondness. Only medical authority we had in our county was one good old fella, a doc, and this is literally the way it happened. It was almost like going to a bootlegger. You take him to the building the doc was in, you had to take him to the back door. You didn't go in where the patients were. Go to the back door, and he would come out in a little old break room type of place and give him a shot in the rump. And that was it. That was it. That was the sum total of medical care available. So when you're on that firing line and you have those kinds of things going on, things like starting to open the door for resources to deal with folks is truly something valuable. So while I never went through any of that, I valued the emergence of that sort of thing. And then over time, we started to grow a little more. And there started to be some facilities that would grow up. Sandy and I were talking about the old things we did as a sort of a stopgap measure when there was nothing available. They called them tapering off places. And we had one that was named Wilmouth, W-I-L-M-I-T-H. And if you think about the amalgamation of that name, you could tell where it came from. It was Wilson and Smith, which boiled down to Wilmouth. And that was put together by a bunch of A folks who just thought there needed to be a place. And for $75, you could take somebody in there and get them tapered off. Now, I never was good at tapering off. I always got drunk when I tapered off. But they were good at it. If nothing else, they taught drunks how to tell time. I don't need to elaborate. But it's amazing. You could take them in there 3 days later, come pick them up, and they're just fine. Yeah, so, man, I love that kind of stuff. So it started to emerge. And then a thing, and what I want to put together with this is like we were talking about this real head of steam we had going with a lot of this hands-on personal work that was going on, very much a part of the legacy and the life stream of Alcoholics Anonymous. And so now what I'm talking about are things that start to move that in a different direction. So it starts to shift that thing around. And so what happened when not so much those local facilities like I'm talking about, but as more formal treatments started to emerge, slowly but surely. There was some around, I didn't know anything about it, but they had the thing going in Minnesota, and I didn't know about that. I'd never heard of it. I read some of the material, but I never heard of the place. And treatment as we know it just was non-existent in the minds of most people. And so that started to come into being. There started to be some treatment facilities open up. And I was one who applauded that very much because I thought it was great if you've been through those nothing available days. You can see why it means a great deal to have a place where the illness can be treated with dignity. It meant a lot to me that we weren't doing it in back alleys anymore, that we were moving out in Main Street. And so I really valued that. And so treatment started to occur, started to build up a little bit. And then something happened that it became politically useful to be supportive of anything that had to do with alcohol or drugs. And I wouldn't have believed it, but what I'm describing now was in the late 60s and early 70s. And in that period into the early 80s, we had an absolute explosion of resources for dealing with folks with alcoholism or addiction. And so it just grew up. It was like the McDonald's franchise. They were just going everywhere. And I never thought I would ever see this happen in my lifetime. But we went through a presidential campaign one time, and one of the platforms on both candidates' tickets was appropriate treatment for alcohol and drugs. I never thought I'd ever see that. So it became a very sexy thing to do. I never thought I'd see the day, but I did see the day, when treatment was available almost on demand anywhere in this country. I never thought I'd see that. Well, some important stuff happened. That by the way, Sandy and I were comparing notes a little bit about, we both went over to Iceland and had a great experience over there. But one thing clicked with me was that those things can get out of hand grossly. And in Iceland, they have socialized medicine, meaning everybody in the country is entitled to treatment on demand at no cost and with no limits. I talked with a guy one day in utter fascination. I talked with a guy who had just finished his 101st treatment cycle. And so I was talking to some of the guys about it, and I said, fellas, have y'all ever heard of a term called enabling? And I said, what do you mean? I said, at some point, the jig's up. I mean, at some point, you got to quit this foolishness and get on down to business. But anyway, like anything can get out of hand. But so we saw this come. And what I want to share with you about it, and you believe me, I have no criticism. I'm not angry at anybody. I don't throw bricks at folks. I think most of what happened that started to change some of the fundamental functions of Alcoholics Anonymous, it was our affair. Most of those wounds were self-imposed. And so when I look at conditions, I'm not talking about anything that an outside entity did to us. I'm talking about what happened within our fellowship as a result of the emergence of these things. And I think what happened, this is just one guy's kind of somewhat objective observation about it, but I think what happened, we went through that kind of a honeymoon period where people felt pretty good about having these things available. But then there started to set in a little nagging discontent about it among us. We started to get into this notion that, well, what are these folks doing? They're doing the same thing we're doing and charging for it. It's a ripoff. Or they're doing our work. Or on and on and on. It started to get into a kind of a negative attitude about the emergence of something that on the one hand I'm deeply grateful for. But on the other hand, there's concerns about what's it doing. See? And I, on it in all candor, my belief is that we failed to adjust, Alcoholics Anonymous, failed to adjust to a new reality that emerged. And that's simply that alcoholics are no longer coming in this door, they're coming in that door. But I think we kept looking at that door and grumbling about the door they came in. And so rather than adapting and modifying what we do, realizing that somebody coming out of a treatment center is not cured, what they've done is gotten to a level that they might be able to engage in recovery. But a person coming out of a treatment center is as new as any 12-step call I've ever had, because they don't teach how to live in recovery in treatment centers. That's not what they're for. What they do is basically deal with the barriers that interfere with engaging in treatment. And so it's a great thing. But what we did, rather than adapting and modifying the way we do 12-step work, instead of being thankful that I don't get puked on anymore, that I don't have to fight some guy with a knife coming after me, that those days are gone, that I'm getting a new person now. And they come in and they smell good and they talk good and they know a lot of language, but didn't deal with that very well. We started to get some groups that not only were apathetic with it, but some that were openly hostile toward the deal and overwhelmed by it. I'll give you an example. We had, in my little old town, they set up a treatment center, and they met with us and negotiated the relationship. They did a wonderful job of establishing a good working relationship. They did better than we did. But we engaged in a good working process that exists to this day. But part of the fallout when that treatment center came into town, there was a guy that had started a new group, and he called it the Newcomers Group. Well, Newcomers is like manna from heaven for a treatment center. Because, my God, man, that's a prescription filled. And so these guys were meeting, And one night, when he called me, a guy said, we got a problem. And I said, what is it? He said, man, these treatment center folks have just beat us to death. And I said, tell me what happened. So what it was, one night, they were starting a meeting, and a bus pulled up, and 40-something people got out of the bus and came in. Now, you'd think everybody'd be saying hallelujah. But there were 5 members in that group. And this guy said, I told him, I said, man alive, isn't that great? You got that many newcomers. He said, no, it's not great. I said, how come? He said, we can't even afford the coffee. Yeah. So it's very real kinds of here and now problems. And this was a good bunch of guys. But it was that kind of thing that started to emerge, and it just got into sometimes just kind of uncomfortable relationships, sometimes tense relationships. We've had some groups that have formally requested treatment centers to not bring people to their meeting. That's recent history. That's not old history. That's recent history. You know, so that we've done a 180. So it introduced a kind of a reaction in it and the one thing that I don't think we can afford in AA is having anger as a core of what drives us, that we can't afford it. Somebody said if we ever go down, it'll be from the inside and not the outside. That's not what happens to us, it's how we react to what happens to us. And so that had some real impact. It also had some impact on how we do our services, where we get into what I call active outreach type of things, you know, where we reach out to carry the message to alcoholics. Let me break that down just a little bit more. Our 5th tradition says each group has but one primary purpose, and that's to carry its message to the alcoholic who still suffers. That's an active term. That's not a passive term. It doesn't say that our primary purpose is to welcome people who come in our door. It says we carry the message to the alcoholic who still suffers, wherever they might be. And so we started to turn back. Nobody planned this. It just happened instinctually. But we started to turn back on our aggressive work with alcoholics. There's no need to. It's like advertising when you got your store so full you can't get anybody in. And so there was no real need, no real motivation to really reach out and do aggressive work. It's a strange kind of a thing that in those days when we were characterized by intensive work with each other, in those early days, pre-60, one of the things you heard, and you'll still hear it from me once in a while because I mean it, but one of the things you heard routinely was, I want a newcomer to come in because I need a newcomer more than he needs me. And when you get into some attitude about where folks are coming from, you lose that spirit. You lose that sense. You lose that reality that you genuinely need that new person more than he needs you. And so that started to erode some things that were extremely important. CPC and PI, cooperation with the professional community, almost drifted into obscurity over the next generation. Almost drifted into obscurity. I'll give you an example of what you run into. That I was out in Colorado in a conference, and they was doing a session on service, and I was just sitting in, and the guy was going on and talking about CPC and or something. But I raised a question. I just posed a question. I was really trying to just trigger the discussion a little bit. I asked a question, and there was a lady in the audience who got interested in my question. And she said, can I ask you a question? I said, yeah, go ahead. She said, I hate to ask this because I'm embarrassed. I've been in AA 21 years. But what is CPC? I told her, I said, I really appreciate you asking that question. And I'll tell you something that I believe you're asking it on probably 75% of the population of AA. You're asking it on their behalf. Because we've let these things drift into such disuse that they're just sort of meaningless acronyms that have very little utility or vitality in many, many areas of the country. And so when I go around, I always talk about these kind of things with people just to get a feel. And in so many places, there has never been, in the history of AA in that town, a public information activity or a CPC activity. never in the history of the group. And so what's happening, if you can see from this, is sort of a deterioration of that kind of real message that Sandy was talking about. We start getting into a little bit more of an objective posture in this thing rather than a real first person that I need you because it'll help me. And so we started to drift away from that a little bit. And those things started to die away. The troubling thing is that shuts us off from the world. And I don't mean to be overly harsh with this, but I don't mean to pussyfoot around either. My impression is that part of the windfall of the direction we've gone is that we probably have the lowest level of respect as a fellowship among the professional community that I can ever remember us having. It's not unusual at all for people to say, yeah, I know about AA, it doesn't work. I know about AA, we had a guy go to a doc talking about a referral process, and the doc thanked him for coming, but he said, we've got a better resource. And so we've really lost something in this thing. If you contrast that to what we were talking about of the critical role of Sister Ignatia and Silkworth, alcoholism isn't any simpler today than it was then. And our dependence on good, solid working relationship with the professional community are not lessened. They may be even greater. So there have been a lot of things that have changed in relation to that. Take that court thing I mentioned, for example, where Roland went in and met with, got the judge to give him Ebby. And he had to be a brave man to request Ebby, but he did. But if you think about that scene. Here's a guy saying, "Don't give Ebby a chance. Give me a chance with you." Where we're petitioning the court. Now today, tell me how an alcoholic in a court setting, if he's influenced in AA, tell me where the influence comes from. Yeah, it's not us. By and large, you got a couple of notable exceptions. But what we've done is a 180. We've done a 180. And today, most of the initiatives from court are by the court. And rather than having a viable relationship in that thing of trying to link the guy in trouble to a resource, we're almost out of it. And so what we wind up with is all over the country, most of the places, we see guys coming into the meeting with a little slip of paper and say, somebody's told me I've got to be here, and will you sign this? And it's, in all honesty, I think that's an awfully cheap way to treat an alcoholic. This illness is too severe for that. It's too severe. And what happens, we lose something important. I'll give you an example of that. I started naming town. I won't name the town, but I was in a Midwestern city a while back. Dropped in on a meeting, and it was a midday meeting, and I just happened to have some time, and I went in and sat in. It was a nice enough meeting, and I was kind of like the psychiatrist at the burlesque show. I'm in the meeting, but I had this thing on my mind about people getting drummed into AA, and it was bothersome to me. It was bothersome. I later figured out why, but it was bothersome. So I went in there, and I had that on my mind. And they had a routine set up. It wasn't only ritualized; it was organized. The secretary sat on a little raised dais out in the middle of the floor, had a desk, had an inbox, and so the folks who came in who had that brand on them came over and dropped it in the box. Then they sit down, and while the meeting's going on, the secretary wrote whatever she wrote on it. And then at the end of the meeting, they'd pick it up and go out. Well, I picked out one guy, and I watched him. I watched every move that he made. Well, I wanted to evaluate, what is this process? And I watched that guy. He came in, very, very courteous fellow. He just walked in, put the paper in the box, went back there, sat down. We did the meeting on step 5, got up, and he got out, picked up his sheet of paper, walked out. He didn't interact with one human. and not one human interacted with him. Is that the way we want to introduce somebody to Alcoholics Anonymous? I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think that's the way you cut through a killer illness. And I think that an alcoholic deserves better than that just because of the nature of the illness. We're not about punishing these folks. We're about trying to capture people who are hitting the wall and giving them a hand out. And I won't pursue that too far, but I really was troubled by that. One day I was flying somewhere. I do my best thinking. I guess the air gets thin or something. I do my best thinking on planes. And no phones, I just right away. And so I started writing up what bothers me about that. As I wrote down the advantages, disadvantages. Why would somebody think that's a good idea? I wrote down 10 things that somebody would think was a good idea. All 10 of them had value for the criminal justice person, the probation officer, whoever, or judge. All 10 of them had value. I put a question mark beside 3 of them because if you really stretch your imagination, it might have some value for a drunk. But I didn't really think so. And on the other side, I think I listed something like 26 things that were wrong with that. 26 things that just made me sort of rebel at that whole process. Now, I never was somebody who would take it out on the guy with the piece of paper. He's already been pushed around enough. He doesn't need to get pushed around here. But I tell you what I would do, I would wimp out. If somebody come to me and say, will you sign this paper? I said, no, Sandy will take care of this. He's a paper-signing fool. And now that's a wimpy way to deal with it. But it just grated on me to do it. And so I'd chicken out. And so I wrote down what it was, Bob, and it was just a whole bunch of things. When he walks in the door, he's branded when he walks in. He's an inferior member when he walks in. He's in a demeaning position in relation to the rest of the group. He feels like a second-class citizen. And a lot of times we treat him like a second-class citizen. You ask somebody to do that, and somebody signs the paper, don't even look at the guy, just some kind of a rote thing. And I wrote down one I had never thought about, which explained why I didn't like to sign them. When I do that, when I sign that piece of paper, 2 things happen. I establish affiliation with the criminal justice agency on behalf of my group. I establish affiliation because I'm engaging in a process that's got nothing to do with AA. The other thing is, it changes the basic nature of my relationship to another alcoholic. I'm not going to be a validator or an inspector or a quality control guy or a verifier. That's not my function, because when I do that, it changes that. What we're talking about here this morning, the power of that message is 2 people sharing together, not one in a superior position, the other in an inferior position. That just bastardizes the process. And so, anyway, by the way, we tackled that in our town. I was meeting with a committee one night, and I said, why don't we tackle that paper thing? And an old boy said, oh, God, Tom, you never get that thing stopped. They do it all over the world. I said, well, let's don't worry about the world. I said, let's just take our little old place here. And so we went to work and taking just that crudely written stuff, handwritten. We went to meet with the director of the probation agency, laid out the thing. He acted like he was threatened. If we go any agency person would get a citizen stomping in, he's going to feel that way. So he's tensed up. And then he read that one I was just talking about the change in the nature, and he said, well, I'll be damned. I never thought of that. I said, me either. And so we changed that. And from that day to this day, there hadn't been a piece of paper in our group. And so one man can make a difference, eh? One man can make a difference. And it's just a matter of getting focus on what needs to be done. Is that the kind of way we want to deal with alcoholics? Yeah, I'll kind of just sort of head for the close down with this, that it impacts this whole business of how we've shifted, impacts all of our vital services. And so what you see is about a 25-year lapse where we got rather passive about these things. We got very passive about them. And we can make a difference in that kind of thing, no matter what it is. let me just tease your fancy just a little bit with this. If you think about the work that needs to be done, that's just one example. That's a very gross, obvious example of somebody being mandated in. It's the same whether it's a guy out of court or a guy out of a medical profession. You want to see somebody that's mandated and monitored to death? Get an impaired doc and see what you got to deal with. Or an attorney. One buddy of mine was sponsored an attorney, and he called me. He said, I don't know what to do with this guy. And he said, they've got this sucker beat to the ground. And I said, tell me about it. So he told me all the stuff the guy had to do in a span of a week. He couldn't do that if he did it full time. And so the lawyer come to him and said, I can't practice law. I'm going to psychiatric counseling, marriage counseling, aftercare, AA. They got no time to practice law. So it gets ludicrous. And the thing I think, like, just think of any place. Driver's license restoration. You want to see something that eats alcoholics alive? Take a look at that. Take a look at that. At the process that goes in to putting the person through the paces, it's just strange what we do. So you name a profession, and it's not peculiar to any. You'll find it in all of them. There are things we can do about that. And that I want to just sort of not just give you a doom and gloom, but maybe get you to think a little bit about something beyond just what's right in front of you. Because those folks who are impaired, I'll tell you one other story about that, and then I'll wrap on the thing. I had one of these docs. I sponsored several of those fellas, and one of them I just went into medical school after he was sober. Now listen to this. He went in and finished his medical training, and he's practicing physician. When he started practicing, the medical board made him go pee in the bottle. And he's 10 years sober. 10 years sober. Now, I'm sure there's some logic in there, but it totally escapes me. What doesn't escape me is the insult, the absolute slap in the face for 10 years of a legacy of shot. It's just stupid, is what it is. And no, I don't have hard feelings about it. But it's just pretty dumb. This guy, I took on this one fella, and he's a delightful man. He's a great CPC guy. I took on this guy, and just came to town. He was sober 2 years after a fashion, and he hadn't had anything. He was an anesthesiologist, and he tended to get himself confused with the patient an awful lot. So they captured him, and he got defrocked and all that stuff. And so when I got him, he was under that gentle care of the medical board. And that guy was monitored big time. And one night, I knew we were going to deal with this thing. One day we were meeting. We always meet at the Holiday Inn and eat breakfast. That's where we meet. And one day he was telling me about, and I said, well, big guy, you got a big day coming up, your 2-year anniversary. And he said, oh, my God, I forgot about that. I can't be there. And I said, oh, why is that? And he said, well, you know that I'm owned by the medical society, medical board. They're having their annual whatever they do, and I got to be there because if I'm not there, they'll know I'm drunk, and I'll be in trouble. And I said, well, I understand conflicts. I said, but that certainly tells me what the agenda will be for our next meeting. And he said, what's that? He was always in a state of awe. You know, he said, what's that? And I said, it'll be about priorities. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, when the things that come to you as a result of your activities in AA become more important than what you do in AA to make them happen, your priorities are shot. He understood that. And that old boy just turned gray. You could just see the blood drain. He turned gray. And he said, I swear, Tom, I don't know what I'll do, but I'll be there. Be there Saturday. I said, okay, that's good. He came in that night, and this was a dress dude that he had to go to. So he was dressed in a tux with a zebra tie and a zebra cummerbund. So I took him around to everybody in the room and introduced him as the offspring of the mating of a penguin and a zebra. Well, we had a great time. We had a great time. And then he went on up there and put up with the stuffed shirts, you know. But see what I'm talking about? If in dealing with those things, those are well-intended people. They're not trying to ruin the guy. But what happens, and part of it is just because of our failure to reach out and engage in the process. What happens is that they move in to territory they ought not to be by default. They're making up for our absence. And my belief is that when the helping agency, I don't care who it is, starts having influence inside Alcoholics Anonymous, it's out of whack. And if we get unduly involved and start trying to influence the outside agency, we're out of whack. What is called for, CPC means cooperation with the professional community. Cooperate means work together. Work together. Because what they're doing is legitimate, what we're doing is legitimate, and all we need to do is close that gap. Close that gap. So it's not something that you logically think about very often, I don't think. But you think of how many docs get into anguish, or attorneys, or pilots, or whoever. And while we can't handle their business, most people would have little objection to sitting down at a table and saying, how can we work together more effectively for the good of the client? Most people would be quite open to that. They wouldn't be open to us going in there telling them what to do, you know, how to do it, all that kind of stuff. They'd run us out. But if we approach that in a helpful manner, you can do a lot of good work. A lot of good work. I'll give you one last example of how easy it is. I've got interested I've had a lot of business with lawyers in one form or another, but I got interested in them. I sponsored a bunch of them, and they were really folks intrigued me. And they had a system, it's got a name, it's a very gentle name, it's called PALS, P-A-L-S. And I'm not sure what it means, but it's a nice term, but it's a sort of a gathering point for captured lawyers, you know, the ones that are in trouble, going to lose their license and all that stuff. And so I started working with some of those guys, and what I saw was that there's enormous difficulties in trying to go through that transition we're talking about, where they're doing their thing, and then we try to get them integrated into AA. It's a really difficult thing. And so what happens in that unknown gap between us and them, you get a gray zone. You're a gray zone of ill-defined kind of stuff, and the lawyers go nuts in that. What they do is try to use a recovered lawyer as a sponsor/monitor. I would submit to you that those are absolutely mutually exclusive terms. You cannot be both. And matter of fact, that same doc I was just talking about, I switched back to the doc for a second. One night, he's doing well, and he's 10 years now. And he was doing well, and one night we were meeting, and he said, I got to go. I've got to go see a fellow, and called his name. It was another doc he was sponsoring. I said, oh, what you got to go for? And he said, I got to get a sample. And I said, no, you don't. And he said, oh, yeah, I do. Yeah, he's got to get it in. And man, they're on his case. And I said, no, you don't. And I told him, I said, you cannot monitor and sponsor. And he said, well, what am I going to do? I said, you or him one called the medical board, preferably you. Call the medical board and tell them you cannot do that sample. And he said, well, why will I tell them I can't do it? I said, tell them because your sponsor in AA said you can't do that. He said, okay. But, I mean, that's damage control, you know. And the thing I was going to say with the lawyers that I just going out, I started doing a quarterly session in the law school, just telling them about the relationship a little bit, and developed a relationship. I spoke at their convention in North Carolina. It was an interesting deal. I had dinner with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and 2 justices and a couple other judges. I'm sitting there, a guy like me, I'm sitting there with all this stuff. And so we finished dinner, and I got up to speak, told them what an honor it was to be there and have dinner with the Chief Justice and all that. And I said, a few years ago, if I'd have had dinner with these guys, it would have been for my last meal. They didn't know, and then I told my story, and they knew. So it's a strange thing. Those people really want to do something. They want to do something. They know that they're in trouble. I talked with the director of that program, and we're setting this in motion now. I talked with the director of that program, and I said, are you ever bothered with people calling you about being lost in this maze? He said, my God, Tom, my day is consumed with calls of people frustrated and lost in it. And I told him a little bit about what I had in mind, that I thought we could improve that relationship. And he said, what would you do? I said, well, I'd put a bunch of y'all on one side of the table and a bunch of us on the other, not too big a bunch, and then we just talk about how we work together. And he said, the only thing I'd ask is be sure I'm at that table. And so people will yield to this kind of thing. But I guess what I'm suggesting to you, and I'm nowhere near done, but I'm going to quit anyway. What I'm suggesting to you is that when you start thinking about what to do with that imagination that gets fired, what I'm suggesting to you, there's a lot to do with that imagination that's fired. I'll guarantee you somebody in this group today is uniquely suited to go and launch a project like this. Doesn't take much. All it takes is give some thought, do the homework, and be prepared to make a sensible kind of business arrangement with people. My belief is that everywhere that an alcoholic hits a wall, and I don't care where that is, everywhere he hits a wall, we ought to, we ought to be sure that whoever is the contact person is equipped to be able to tell the person, hey, there's help right over here, and here's how you can get it. Okay? And so you think about that, and alcoholics hit the wall all over the place, at minister's office, social workers' offices, healthcare, you name it, but everywhere. And if that's going to happen, it'll be because we do that. They don't teach that in social work school or universities. They just don't teach it. That's our deal. But if you really want to be of service, if you really want to make a difference and get that thing humming with the professional community, just simple little things like that can have monumental effects on it. So, Sandy,
well, thank you.
Ready, buddy.
Well, now we'll shift gears to the message. And I'm going to try and draw some of the same analogies that Tom did. When we read chapter 5, we get to the end, and it said, we're alcoholic and couldn't manage our own lives. Hey. So you start with certain premises. Okay, you're an alcoholic, can't manage your own life. My God, what can we do about that? Well, let's eliminate something else. No human power can help you. So don't be looking for any human power. And finally, God could and would if he were sought. So the message is how to seek God. That's what the message, that's what the steps are. And the way that it is delivered is by convincing the person that they're in a situation where if they don't choose to seek God, it could be very, very bad. So it has nothing to do with convincing them of the wonderful things that'll happen if you seek God, but rather of the horrible things that will happen if you don't seek. So it's a wonderful way to get things started. And of course, our old ideas are the biggest blockade that we have to these things because we have to get rid of them in order to make any progress whatsoever. And I remember my sponsor would say to me in the beginning, it's time now. We've been going to meetings, don't drink. Go to meetings, don't drink. Go to meetings, don't drink. Make coffee. Now we got to get on the spiritual path. So let me take a spiritual inventory of you. I want you to be totally honest with me about spirituality. Okay, Bill, okay. Do you pray a lot? How often do you pray? I said, Bill, I don't like praying. I don't like the word prayer. I don't want to, zero praying. Zero. Okay, do you ever go to churches? They're very spiritual buildings. You ever go in? Do you hang around? I don't like churches. I was brought up in one. It made me sick. I can't stand it. I see a church on the road. I go around it. Churches, zero. Churches. What about spiritual readings? There's lots of spiritual books. They have comforting ideas. There's just this whole ambiance that people get involved in. I said, I like mystery novels, history, books like that, but put me down zero. Zero spiritual reading. I don't want, none of that. What about meditation? No, I don't like meditation. I heard about it. I saw some guy sitting still one day. It doesn't appeal to me. I don't want anything to do with meditation. So I gave him my zero report. And then he said, well, I just got one more question. Okay. How's it going? So there is no comparison of theories. There's comparison of results. Results. I had a great theory about how life ought to be lived. I was wearing a wristband from a nut ward, no one would listen to me. And so I had my plan for living, my ideas, and they produced terrible results. Then there was AA and program of attraction. Yes, I do like what they have. Wow. Well, this is how they got it. This is how they got it. So we start out from a position of desperation, and then we are led down this path. Essentially, the path is an inward journey to our own Creator, which is part of us. Bill said the fundamental idea of God is inside of us. It's been there ever since we were little, much like the idea of a friend. And as we discover in the steps, it's blocked. There's a lot of things blocking this contact with this spiritual energy, this higher power. And it's blocked so thoroughly that we're convinced it doesn't exist. I've never felt it. I never felt any great spiritual awakening. As far as I'm concerned, it's all just a theory. That's right. You're right. Nobody's arguing with you. But we have actions that, if you are willing to take them, will remove the blockages to this energy, and you will feel it, and then we can learn how to maintain it. So, that's a very short summary of what the steps really do, and so I never realized what the power of a decision is. How do you become a believer? Well, how'd you become a non-believer? I don't know, it's about 9, I decided, screw it. So you became a non-believer by deciding to be a non-believer. And so now that's good. You made that decision. And we ask you the same question. How's it going? Which is the same thing you do with any other decision. Well, I decided to live in St. Louis. How do you like it? I can't stand it. Why don't you move back to Chicago? In other words, I decided, and then I got results. You decided to be a non-believer? How is it? Maybe that wasn't a good decision. Well, how do I become a believer? I decide. Made a decision in the 3rd step. It's really simple, isn't it? Okay, so now I'm a believer. Now what do? We watch the results, and we compare them. Well, I've been a believer for 3 years. It's a lot better than being a non-believer for 3 years. You see, I mean, it is amazing how practical a lot of this is. I just make a decision. And so the point that I want to make out of all of this is the spiritual path is backwards to the concepts that we've had in the material world. And I'll give you the analogy. When I went in the Marine Corps, I became a pilot. And like many other things that you're learning how to do, you start out as a student. So you start out with an instructor in the plane with you. And then you fly and fly and fly. And I think it was after 12 flights in Navy flight school, the instructor says, you're now ready to do it on your own. You remember that? Remember everything that you learn, the purpose is to eventually do it on your own. You know what I'm saying? And then they give you the plane, he's not even in it. And you go, oh, I'm doing this on my own. Now, if you try that in the spiritual world, you're doing nothing but asking for trouble. But there's a tendency, well, when I was brand new, I really had to depend on my sponsor and my home group and others and on my higher power. But it seems to me that after 5 or 10 years, I ought to be a little further along. You follow what I'm saying? I ought to be a little further along towards what? Independence. You see the trick that goes into this? So part of the problem with the spiritual message is that as success comes along, it works against it. Does that make any sense at all? I'll give you a good example. Back in the old days, it was not uncommon for a city or a town to only have one meeting a week. One meeting. You know what I mean? And Wednesday night, we meet at Al's house from 8 to 9. Now, you got to get through, as an alcoholic, you got to get through till next Wednesday. And if you ask the old-timers how they did it, they said, well, I'd try to find Joe at some point during the week and get together for coffee. Mostly, I just prayed a lot. I just prayed a lot. Now we got morning meetings, noon meetings, night meetings, afternoon meetings. I mean, we got everything, clubs, we got everything. Now we don't have to pray a lot. You see what I'm saying? Don't have to pray a lot. Don't have to pray a lot. So I guess what I'm saying is, the more desperate that it was, the better it was. The more we had to rely on prayer and our higher power, the better off we were. And so all of the things, just like when the treatment centers, well, let me help you with that burden of having to pray all the time. We could set up answering services to calm you down in the middle of the night. We could set up this, call me anytime. We could have a meeting from all of them. We got a club, you can go there. We got a million alternatives to praying. All of which are making us less dependent on our higher power. And so this is what I am trying to talk about today, is spirituality is becoming more dependent on our higher power with each passing year. And so every time I go to meetings, and I've just started to be aware of this myself. I'm not criticizing anybody. I'm just saying, as awareness evolves and you start looking around, you see where apparent success is really working against us. But if you will imagine this, if we were to perfectly follow the program, which is complete reliance on a higher power, for everything, For everything. We just completely rely on our higher power for everything. And you see this in the 10th step in the big book. In other words, as I go back and really take a look at these, the spiritual awakening is described in the promises that come at the end of the 9th step, because all those verbs in there are very spiritual verbs. This is not a psychological process. You don't describe it that way. What if you've been frightened about other people and financial insecurity plagued you forever and ever, and then someone says, oh, that'll leave you. It'll leave you. It'll leave me? Yeah. Yeah. You just do these, make these amends, and that'll leave you. And what if it does? What if it does? It just leaves you. You know, you look and you go, God, how did that happen? You start wondering, how did that happen? All I did was think about myself all the time. Don't worry, self-seeking is going to slip away. It's going to slip away. It is? I've only thought about myself all the time forever. How could it slip away? Well, just do this inventory and make those amends. Go back, go out there and talk to those people, go da-da-da-da, and then you go, geez, I am a lot freer. What's going on? What is going on? And as each one of these very unusual events occurs, an awareness starts to build. It's no longer 6 coincidences in a row, and then we get to the last sentence in the promises. We suddenly realize that God is doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. That is a spiritual awakening. It is an awareness that all this stuff is happening because of God. And it's just, oh my God. So right after that, in the big book it says, we are entering the world of the Spirit, as it starts talking about the 10th step. Now we've done the work. We've done the work over here. We've removed the barriers. We've gotten rid of the stuff that's blocking us. We've settled with the past, enabling us to, for the first time in our lives, live in the now. Well, the now is the only place that God exists. It's the only way we can have contact with this power. And the power does exactly the verbs that the promises were describing. Because Bill goes on in the 10th step to describe spiritually our relationship with alcohol. I don't know if you remember that. He says, we haven't sworn off. We've been placed in a position of neutrality. What the hell is that? You ever gone to a psychiatrist and says, don't worry, I'm going to place you in a position of neutrality with that addiction that you have. We haven't even sworn off. I've been making amends is what I've been doing. Now the problem doesn't exist for me. What do you mean the problem doesn't exist? I'm an alcoholic. What do you mean the problem doesn't exist for me? Well, that's what it says. It doesn't exist. And then comes the spiritual description of a spiritual solution. The problem has been removed. But we have to be careful, for alcohol is a subtle foe. And we are not cured of it. What do we have? A daily reprieve contingent on our spiritual condition. So this happens. And it happens if we are seeking, if we have a proper guide. I call sponsors guides. And they are to take us down a path where this event will take place, and then the society that we're in will help us maintain this awareness and this connection. In other words, spirituality is being in a constant state of receiving help. You follow what I'm saying? We're in a constant state of receiving help.